so just as a quick reminder, just to get us started logistically, there's not going to be any class this Thursday, but this is the only Thursday where that's going to be the case. Yeah. Okay, so let me go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk a little bit about interpretability. And just to kind of get us started with the sort of mathematical setup, and honestly, the mathematical part of it is actually not that bad to understand once you kind of understand what it is that we're going for with interpretability. So let me spend a good amount of time talking about the kind of basic idea of what you might mean by interpretability of a model. Okay, so just to get us thinking about it. So you know, basically, what do you have when you have a model? Well, you have a bunch of data, and you're feeding it into some mathematical model. Let me just, for the moment, just call it M. But in a second, it's going to take a very specific form that we're going to concentrate on for the next few lectures. But you can have in the back of your mind that this is just like a neural network. So we've been talking a lot about neural networks with ReLU activation, so just keep that in mind. So I'm just going to draw kind of a toy description of such an object, and these are sort of supposed to be the neurons of your neural network, and then these are supposed to be the connections or sort of modeling synapses for your neural network. Okay, so you have your data, you have your model, and now what might be nice in order to be able to interpret what the model is doing on the data? Well, the first thing that might be nice is what we typically refer to as alignment. It is referred to as alignment between the neurons, or more generally, the computational units of your model. So in the case of something like a neural network, the basic computational units, you can think of the neurons as being the basic computational units of your model. And concepts, human interpretable concepts. So when I say human interpretable concept, I mean exactly what you're probably thinking, which is just something that some idea that humans recognize as kind of a distinct idea. So some examples might be floppy-haired or wise. I don't know, just some human interpretable concept. Okay, so what should we mean by alignment? Well, we should mean that anytime you have some data point in your data set, so this is some kind of finite set that you're going to feed into your model, that the neurons that light up on X are precisely, well, so right, okay, so what would we like is that each one of these neurons actually corresponds to a human interpretable concept. And those concepts light up on data if and only if the concept is present in this data. Okay, so there's going to be interpretable concepts. That means there exists a bijection, one-to-one correspondence between neurons and concepts. And the neuron is active or lights up. So right now I'm just being informal, but in a second I'm going to try to be more formal. If the concept is present. If and only if the concept is present in X. Okay, so you might feed this X through the model in some way, and if, say, this neuron here is the concept for floppy-eared, and this X happens to be a picture of like a, I don't know, Dalmatian or something, then this neuron is going to light up, and it will only light up when this X is has that floppy-eared concept. So this is the informal description of what we mean by alignment between neurons and concepts and data. Okay. So let me now kind of try to formalize this a little bit. So just say that the ideal scenario for interpretability of the model, or it's kind of the start to what you would want for interpretability of a model, and how it handles data, is that the standard, and you might see the word privileged, aka privileged, basis vectors for, so by the way, typically this model itself is kind of represented by some high dimensional vector space, and the neurons correspond to basis vectors in this big vector space. Okay, so this is kind of a confusing way to think of it when we're thinking about something like a ReLU neural network. But you have these layers and they're mapping to each other. But when I say Rn here, I mean just take the direct sum over all the layers, and then you have these maps between them, et cetera. But the point is that each of these neurons actually specifies a basis vector in this big vector space. Specifying the model. So the standard aka privileged basis vectors. Let me actually write down. It's actually in the notes. So I thought carefully about how to say it. The computational units in the model. Are in bijective correspondence with concepts. So in particular, if this is, so I said that you may as well have in mind something like a feed-forward neural network. So let's just write that down right now. So this looks like something like this. It has layers, it has an input layer, an output layer, and a bunch of hidden layers. Are in bijective correspondence with concepts. So what I mean is that in particular, if the ith neuron of the Lth layer corresponds to concept let's give it a name, CLI. And I'm going to use my notation from before. ZLI is the pre-activation output of that neuron. So remember, each of these layers is an affine linear transformation with a component-wise activation. And now you can map to some particular layer, and then before you apply the activation function, you can you can look at the output of that neuron, that particular neuron, so you project onto that component. Is the pre-activated output of the ith neuron in the ELF layer. Then what we're wanting is that also there's this alignment between the concepts and the data. So point is that the sign, that pre-activation sign. So this is saying that the neuron is active on a data point X. And like the concept is present or embodied by this data point. And moreover, the sort of intensity of activation corresponds to the intensity of the concept being present. So in other words, you have two data points. And you look at the pre-activation output of this neuron on these two different data points. And you notice that this one is bigger than this one. And they're both activated. You can say something like it's more present. X2 than X1. Or appears more strongly in X2 than in X1. Okay. Is it sort of clear what we're doing here? So the sort of hope somehow is that everything is linear. Everything in sight is linear, and the linear structure is in alignment with something that's human interpretable. This is the sort of hope of, I think of a lot of, at least a first pass at understanding interpretability for these models. Okay. So let me just put a name on this. Terminology on this. So when I talk about this ideal scenario described above, this is often described as the neurons are monosemantic. They have a single meaning or interpretable. And to be honest, I don't know to what extent people believe, like really believe that there is kind of a monosemantic model out there, or there are monosemantic models out there. But I think that is kind of the starting point for a lot of the research, that they really do sort of believe that this is true, at least close enough to true that that we can work with it. Okay. So let me just say at the outset that real world models are not believed to be monosemantic. So Note. So when you train a model, models not believed to be monosemantic. So, I mean, the first thing that you might notice is that, you know, if you train a model on some data, and you're trying to see whether or not the privileged basis vectors, i.e. the particular neurons in your network actually mean anything, well, probably they won't, because for one thing, that particular basis is privileged. There's no reason to believe that the basis that you're kind of describing everything in terms of is special in any way, really. So just as a first point, so there's no reason to believe privileged basis means anything. The model means anything is special. And in a lot of cases, and we'll see this later, a lot of redundancy comes out of the fact that there are kind of standard ways to change your basis that play well with your activation function, so that you get another basis, and it's and the model is exactly the same. That's the point. The function that the model computes is exactly the same. But even leaving that aside, even if we allow for change of basis, it's still not believed to be the case. So in practice, and I think this is really more empirical evidence. Just there typically exists more concepts used in a model computation than the dimension of the vector space, the overall vector space, the number of neurons. Okay. And moreover, concepts are observed to interfere with each other. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
I would have thought that it was the other way around, right? For example, a network which tries to identify cats and dogs, they have two concepts about love neurons, right?
Right, yeah, it's trying to identify cats and dogs, but but the idea is that it's using a lot more concepts along the way in order to do that identification. So it might identify something about the fuzziness of the hair, or like where the eyes are located, yeah. Okay. Okay, so just kind of using our terminology. So neurons in real world models tend to be what's called polysemantic. So again, everything that I'm saying so far, not everything, but many of the things that I'm saying are informal, because a lot of the discussion actually in the literature so far is informal and based largely on empirical evidence and not so much on theory. So so this is all background for setting up what I'd like to talk about for the rest of today, which is the superposition hypothesis. So you could think of the superposition hypothesis as being some way to to understand how you might find a monosemantic model, you might recover some kind of monosemantic or interpretable model from a real world model. So the superposition hypothesis. It's some kind of mathematical framework. Mathematical hypothesis. For recovering a monosemantic model. A real world model. It's a guess for how you might get such a thing. Okay. So by the way, sometimes I'll call monosemantic models disentangled. And the point being that you have this really nice separation between the concepts and they're aligned with the neurons. So there's this sort of disentanglement. And these real world polysemantic models, I might sometimes call entangled. And let me just say, before I describe the superposition hypothesis. So, I mean, the whole idea behind why you might want to have these sort of nice basis vectors that correspond one-to-one, well, besides the fact that it's like a nice picture, is that you really want concepts to be distinct from each other. So the way that that's implemented mathematically is that in a vector space is that concepts are orthogonal to each other. Because the way that we actually determine whether or not a concept is present in some vector that we've kind of mapped into that space is to take the dot product with that concept. And now if you have two concepts that are not orthogonal and you take a dot product with a third vector, then if they're pointing in the same direction, then those dot products will be correlated. But if they're orthogonal, then they won't. Okay, so what we somehow really want to do is kind of create a space where we've kind of one hot encoded these concepts. But actually the idea is that in practice, in the real world, that would be too computationally intense. You know, if we really did have this huge vector space with like a million different distinct concepts, every single computation that you did would take ridiculously long time. So there's always the point that you need to be able to do computations quickly. So what you'd really like to do is take this, sort of huge space and compress it into some smaller space. So that's the other thing that's floating in the background here. So let me rather than just kind of waving my hands, let me just say that the key mathematical idea behind the superposition hypothesis, which I'll state carefully in a second, or the key mathematical fact, I should say, which I'll try to return to at some later date, but I just want to at least give you the idea. It's something called the Johnson-Lindenstrass lemma. I think it's Strauss without a U, but I could be wrong. Johnson-Lindenstrass lemma. And I'm not going to state this formally, but essentially what it says is that you can have a large number of almost orthogonal, epsilon orthogonal vectors. So almost non-interfering in terms of their dot products. Epsilon orthogonal vectors in Rn. Especially as n gets large. So, right, if you're in Rn, you can fit at most n orthogonal vectors in there, and mutually orthogonal vectors. But if n gets very large, it's actually, it turns out that the number of epsilon orthogonal for, various, so it's going to depend on epsilon, obviously. But the number of epsilon orthogonal vectors, meaning the dot product is less than epsilon in absolute value, grows exponentially with n, turns out. So in other words, let me just, if you imagine trying to solve the following problem, just like that. So here's the problem, the general problem, the toy problem that this is trying to solve. So choose k vectors in Rn. Okay, so essentially what you're doing, you're letting these k vectors be the columns of some matrix, let's call it V. Such that V transpose V is pretty close to the identity matrix. So in other words, so we're familiar with this from last time, that V transpose V, the entries of V transpose V are just the pairwise dot products of the columns of V. And so what we want is that on the diagonal, they're ones. In other words, the norms of the VIs are 1. And then the pairwise dot products, so off the diagonal, you're not 0, but you're small. Okay, so everything off the diagonal is less than epsilon. This is what you want. And the point is that the Johnson-Lindenstrass lemma tells you that K grows, the number of K, the size of this matrix K grows sort of exponentially in n. It's kind of an amazing fact, but it's not so hard to believe if you start trying to kind of fit like pretty close to orthogonal vectors together in a space. So it defies our intuition a little bit, but the point is that actually the geometry of high dimensional spaces is very, very interesting and defies intuition. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. So note the geometry of high dimensional spaces. In fact, if you pick a pair of vectors in a very high dimensional space, they will almost surely have a very, very small dot product. So I'll try to say more about this later, but for now, just kind of believe me that high dimensional spaces are interesting geometrically. So there's a lot of compression that can happen without too much interference, is the way that we should think about this. So, these real world models can actually do computations for some much, much higher dimensional space without too much interference, whatever we mean by interference. All right, so let me now state the superposition hypothesis carefully. And again, I I could mean various things, honestly, but I'm gonna state it in just a particular way for the class of feed-forward Brownian neural networks. And we may state it in other ways later for more general situations. And just keep in mind also, I mean, we've been talking about transformers the last couple of lectures. So these are the MLP parts of transformers. So transformers have this embedding layer and then attention layers and then MLPs. And the MLPs, to be honest, actually constitute the majority of the parameters of the network, about 2/3 in practice. So somehow these ReLU neural network parts of transformers are where a lot of the action does happen. Okay, so here's the superposition hypothesis stated for feed-forward ReLU neural networks. So, okay, so here's a feed-forward ReLU neural network. So I just say given such a network. And you can imagine you've obtained this function by training on some data. Okay, so you've obtained this real world model by training on some data. Remember, when I write this down, I could either mean a specific function or the whole parameterized class of functions. So I'm imagining that I've done some optimization procedure, so now I have a single function here. Okay, so given this a trained real world model, the superposition hypothesis posits that there exists some higher dimensional model so here is we call the disentangled monosemantic. And this is the entangled real world polysemantic model. And so given this, there exists this, and also there are the corresponding maps. And moreover, you can get back and forth. So there's also encoding and decoding maps at each layer. So for reasons that will, well, I sort of prefer to think of these as being decoding maps and these as being encoding maps, but I'm going to call these the decoding maps and these the encoding maps because it matches with what I'm going to do in a second. So given a real world entangled model, there exists a probably higher dimensional disentangled model such that it performs the same computation. So that's the first thing that you want to be true. And you probably also want it to be true that it performs the same computation at each layer. But various things can be relaxed depending on how strict you want to be about the hypothesis. But the first thing that I'll say, so just to kind of write everything down. So for each layer, For each layer L. EL and DL. We're calling encoding, decoding maps. And the important point is that the privilege basis of the privilege basis elements of Rn1 to Rnd correspond bijectively to human interpretable concepts. Call them C tilde L. Layer L, neuron I. And also, this computation can be performed by first mapping up, mapping over, and mapping down. So, so for each layer, or you might just relax it to the whole map. The whole map. In the sort of obvious way. Oh, okay. This. Over. That's right. Another way to relax it is that you might want that it just holds up to like some epsilon error or something like that. And you might also relax it to just be on a particular data set or on, you know, there are various things you could say here, but kind of the strictest version of the superposition hypothesis is that it works on the whole space and it works exactly. And then also what you, yeah.
So if we're embedding into larger dimensional spaces that correspond bijectively with human concepts, but each of our original spaces are pretty wide, right? They have like, I think our little n's can be like 250 plus dimensions. How human interpretable is this aimed to be then? Because we're going up in dimensions, that seems to be potentially making the problem worse.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying. That somehow already our models were really big, and that maybe this is not necessary in order to get at all the concepts. But I think it is somehow believed that it is, because you really want the concepts, the particular concepts that you're identifying to be pretty precise.
So like if I want to look at how the network does on a specific concept and trace that through, maybe this would be more useful than trying to embed everything all at once into larger spaces.
Right. I mean, so let's see, I'm not sure I'm answering what you're asking, but I mean, I think the basic idea is that people have tried to take, you know, transformer language models, look at the neurons, see which ones light up for different, you know, on different types of data. Say the data is like HTML code, or say the data is like Python code. And you kind of want that it's the case that that on that data, it lights up maybe just on one neuron. You know, that's not gonna happen, but like, yeah, maybe you can get some, yeah. But the hope is that if you get a nice enough disentangled model, you will be able to actually identify a neuron that for whatever data you feed it will just light up on Python code. But and maybe not even just Python code, but like Python code about I don't know, you know, Python code involved in doing a specific kind of task, or even more than that. But yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, I'm just describing a mathematical idea, but the logistics of actually implementing, using this idea to try to interpret what something like a transformer is doing is messy. It's much messier than some kind of mathematical model would suggest that it is. But I think that this is kind of a useful idea, and has proved useful, at least to some teams, in thinking about how to do interpretation for transformers. Okay. Right, so let me just write down a few more things. Right, and then I guess the last thing I wanted to say is that you want that the sign. So here I'm kind of being a little bit relaxed about my notation, but the point is that if you have a data point and you map it up into this disentangled network, and then you map it over, that's what I mean. And then you project onto the ith neuron in the alpha layer. That's what I mean by z tilde Li of x. And you want this to be greater than 0. If and only if this concept is present or active. Okay. So questions about the setup, about the mathematical setup. Okay, so now for the rest of the time, what I'll do is I'll describe a simple, a very simple first pass using this idea that a team from Anthropic used to kind of to try to identify disentangled neurons in some hypothetical, monosemantic neurons in some hypothetical disentangled network. Okay, so next, I'll describe so a team at Anthropic, and I'll put a link to the paper. This is Fricken et al. And the paper, the blog post, it's something like towards monosemanticity. So they used a simple called dictionary learning algorithm to discover monosemantic neurons in a disentangled model. So this sounds a lot simpler than what it is that they actually did. But the basic mathematical idea is pretty simple. So I'm going to describe that. but there was a lot of engineering that went on beyond that. Hypothetical. So before I actually describe the specifics of this procedure, I want to tell you a little bit about what I mean by dictionary learning. Because I think it's important that all of this fits into a bigger context. So, I mean, what essentially are they trying to do here? Really, they're trying to guess, guess this collection of higher dimensional spaces, and then somehow, and then also guess the form of. So really what they're trying to do, they have this real world model down here. What they're actually trying to learn is the encoding and decoding maps at each of the layers. And they have they used an algorithm, a pretty simple algorithm to learn those. So they guessed this, they just chose some random high dimension, basically. And then they guessed the forms of these maps, and then they trained essentially another little ReLU network in order to learn the parameters for these maps. Okay, but let me first give you a little aside on sparse dictionary learning. So, I think I kind of failed to say something before that was actually fairly important. So, so the other important thing to say is that for any given computation, the number of concepts that you will probably be using for that computation is actually small with respect to the total number of concepts. So yeah, this is kind of getting back to what Sophia was asking about a little bit. But the idea is that for any given computation, the hypothesis is that when you lift it to this disentangled space, actually probably only a few concepts will be lit up at a time during the computation. So this is kind of what's behind what I'm about to say next. So, so here's the sort of basic setup for dictionary learning. So let X be a vector in some space. And usually here they call it a signal. But you should just really think of this as being the image of a data point in some layer of a model. So what you really want to do is to be able to represent X sparsely with respect to some fixed finite set of vectors. So X admits S sparse epsilon approximation over a dictionary D. So here, you're now thinking of taking n vectors in RD. So D here So the n columns of this G are called the dictionary, or sorry, are called the atoms of the dictionary. And what you want is that X is actually close to being a linear combination of just S of these. So in terms of this finite set, you can express X. So, you know, let's just think about this geometrically. You've got these n vectors inside of RD, and what you're really wanting is that X is close to some S-dimensional subspace spanned by some subset, some size S subset of this set. So, right. Yeah, so this set is kind of defining a bunch of different lower dimensional subspaces of this space. And what you want for an S sparse representation of X is that X is close, epsilon close to one of those S-dimensional subspaces. So for dictionary D, if there exists less than or equal to S columns of D. Say DI1 through DIS. So some S of these columns. Say X minus, there's some linear combination of these. So X is less than or equal to distance epsilon from the span of these S columns. And you can ask the same thing for, so given a finite data set, X, so M data points, epsilon greater than 0. And again, a sparsity level S. So the sparse dictionary learning problem in general. The following. You start with some finite data set. And at sparsity level S. Learn the dictionary. Which here I'm going to suggestively write as having capital N sub L atoms, because this is actually the problem that we're going to be solving, that the Anthropic team used an algorithm to solve. Basically, what they're trying to do is find these end up being the projections of the privileged basis for this hypothetical disentangled network. So what they're learning is actually these atoms, and it with the property that satisfying For all columns xi of x, there exists a subset of columns of D such that xi can be written as a, or is epsilon close to the span of those columns of D. There's this a subset DIS. Each of the columns is epsilon close. I'll just write it this way. Okay, so this is the sparse dictionary learning problem that Anthropic is solving with their algorithm, or is, sorry, not exactly guaranteeing that they're solving, but at least they are trying to do this. Okay, so I just want to kind of make a quick remark about sparse dictionary learning in general. So, I mean, the first remark is kind of an obvious remark. If you allow your vector space, or sorry, if you allow the number of atoms in your dictionary to be equal to the size of your data set, then this problem is trivial. So because you just use, you can get a one sparse, yeah, right. You just make X be equal to D, and then you have one sparse representations of each of your xi's, because your xi's are kind of exactly your atoms. So if NL is equal to M, D equal X is a one sparse dictionary. For any epsilon. So this is kind of a boring case. What's more interesting is to make an NL be less than M. And then it's an NP hard problem. But there do exist classical algorithms. I think this is actually a really interesting area of study, which I think people refer to as compressed sensing, or it's at least related to compressed sensing. This area is, I think, a really cool mathematical area.
Is NL fixed? Yes.
I mean, yeah, so no, not in general. I mean, I think the point is that well, you might want to fix NL in advance. So you might want to just, you know, say you have some, you have a data set, you know what its size is, and you know maybe some stuff about the probability distribution that it's sampled from. And then, yeah, maybe you fixed NL in advance, but maybe you have some wiggle room and you want to fix some kind of sparsity level. And then you want to see whether or not you can do this. And yeah, again, there are algorithms that are out there, but they are not super efficient. Okay, so let me just kind of give you a simplified version of the Anthropic experimental setup, because I think it's so I just want you to see that actually out there in practice, like the cutting edge research on these kinds of things don't actually come with guarantees that they've solved any of these problems. They're really just trying to construct an algorithm that they hope will do something like this, but they can't necessarily guarantee that it will. Okay, so let me give you a simplified version of the Anthropic experimental setup. So they used an atom optimizer, so that you should think of this as being some version of stochastic gradient descent. So an optimization, a gradient-based optimization algorithm. On an L1 regularized loss, to encourage sparsity. And essentially what they were doing is just constructing for each layer. So let's just look at particular. So this is the sort of, this is the entangled model, this is the disentangled model, this is the hypothetical disentangled model. So this is what you kind of start with. And this is what, so you're guessing a large enough capital NL. And what you're trying to do is learn parameters. So you also guess the form of these maps. And the form that they choose is to make this be a very simple one hidden layer ReLU neural network. So one hidden layer ReLU neural network. So EL is an affine linear map with a component-wise ReLU. DL is just an affine linear map. Linear map, DL is affine linear map. I'm not going to give it a name if I. And this particular setup has a particular name. This is what's called overcomplete sparse autoencoder. Overcomplete sparse autoencoder. And if you've ever actually worked with any ML models, you've probably worked with autoencoders that are not overcomplete, but that are undercomplete. Namely, it's actually kind of funny to see something like this, where the dimension of this space is larger than the dimension of these spaces. So usually what you're trying to do with an autoencoder is something like PCA. You're trying to dimension reduce your data. So you put a bottleneck layer in here, and then you train it to learn the identity function. So I'll say this a little bit more slowly in a second. But essentially that's what you're doing here as well. You're trying to make it so that the outputs of points here map close to where they started, as close as possible to where they started. So you do that by picking an appropriate loss function. And then this sparse, encouraged sparsity is coming from adding a regularization term to encourage the result to have sparsity here. So I'll write it down. Okay, so. Okay, so this is a classical, in a way, semi-supervised or self-supervised learning problem. So the idea is that if you have a data set, so say you have M data points to train on, it's your data set, and they're not labeled. So all that you're trying to do with this setup is find maps EL and DL such that the composition takes these points close to themselves. Okay, so this is what I meant by trying to learn the identity function. So you're trying to learn a decomposition of the identity function. But just on this data set. Okay, so let's like the first time I heard about autoencoders, I thought it was really strange to me, because how do you learn the identity function when you're mapping through like a lower dimensional space, for example? But the point is not that you're trying to like, obviously you're not going to get a decomposition of the identity if you take a linear map. Let's just, for simplicity, imagine that we're just talking about linear maps, because affine linear is not that much harder, but you know, ReLU is more complicated. But let's just for the moment think that we're talking about linear maps. So all you're going to be able to do is take your high dimensional space, project it to a low dimensional space, and then embed that space back into this high dimensional space. But the whole point is that you're kind of hoping that your data is already close to a lower dimensional space, so that when you do that, it's not going to move your data that much. And yeah, if you have some nonlinearity, then maybe that will help you as well, that it will be close to some lower dimensional object that's maybe not linear, but has some interesting geometry to it. Okay. And now in this setting, you're mapping into a higher dimensional space. So actually, there are a lot of ways to decompose the identity in this case. And yeah, regardless of your data. But the point is that imposing sparsity makes things a little harder. So I think I'm mostly saying some informal things, but hopefully it's helpful kind of understanding what it is that we're trying to do. So we're trying to learn a decomposition of the identity just on our data set. And what we're trying to do is find the best parameters for EL and DL to minimize, well, the overall average distance. Moved by squared distance. Okay, so you're trying to make sure that when you compose EL and DL on XI, that you land pretty close to XI. So this is the sort of unregularized loss that you'd be using. This is the unregularized training objective. And when you regularize, what that means is that you add an extra term that you scale up and down depending on how much you want it to affect the result. That if it grows, if that grows too large, then it's going to kind of encourage the parameters to go a different way. So I'll just write down. Regularize to encourage sparsity of the lifted, of the sort of encoded map in this higher dimensional space. So you regularize to encourage sparsity of this. So the point is that you add a term, it looks like lambda, so this is some real number greater than 0. This is the regularization parameter. So you can scale it up and down depending on how much you want to encourage sparsity. And the term that you add looks like something like this, or the term that they added is something like this. So this is the sum of the absolute values. This is the L1 norm of the lift of xi. Okay, and as you tune this up, the minimization, the optimization problem encourages sparsity more. Tune it down and encourages it less. That's the idea. So again, this is all like there are no guarantees, by the way. So what they did is just some process that worked pretty well. And there was no guarantee that it was going to give you an S-sparse solution or an S-sparse dictionary or anything like that. But the remark that I want to just close with, so I'll tell you a little bit more next week about what results they did get, which were actually pretty impressive, just from this very simple algorithm that had no guarantees associated to it. But just to have it on the board and in your notes. First of all, the columns of the linear map DL. Actually, I think it actually was a linear map, not even affine linear. So it wasn't quite a ReLU network. I think that they actually made the DL map be just a linear map on the nose. And the reason that they did that is that they wanted the columns to be a sparse dictionary. Columns of DL are a dictionary. So these are just the images, the privileged basis. We don't really necessarily know what its sparsity level is going to be, but at least this is a dictionary. Not guaranteed to be sparse. I guess we really wanted it to be sparse upstairs. Let's just say it's a dictionary for the entangled model. Okay, and then the second thing I'll say is that the setup has encouraged but not guarantees sparsity. Upstairs. And I'll go ahead and end it there for today.
Thank you, Ellie.
Happy to answer questions after class too. Thank you on
I-
Zoom. Oh yeah.
I have a
go-
quick I have a quick question, and maybe you had mentioned this, but since I'm not an expert in algebraic geometry or anything of this nature, is there like a more direct analog to poly or monosemanticity with respect to that formalism? Like it doesn't seem like I saw some kind of exact mapping or analogy in the lecture, like something that allows you to bring more that the power of your formalism to sort of understand this phenomena better. Because a lot of this that you went through kind of is basically just what the practitioner field has looked at. I'm just kind of curious if that's even a well-defined question in your respect.
Well, so, yeah, I mean, it may be the case that out there are a lot of different things that people might mean by monosemanticity and polysemanticity out in the wild, depending on who you talk to. I think that what I presented here is just one way of kind of understanding what I believe some subset of people mean when they say that. And I mean, this is probably not answering your question, but it's at least saying something that I think is true for me. When I read the literature, I find it really, really hard to kind of feel like I'm understanding what anybody is saying because nobody says precisely what it is that they're saying. They're kind of talking informally about all of these concepts. So I mean, I felt like the way that it was described in the Anthropic blog at least allowed me to extract something that I felt was close to what they were saying and was like an actual mathematical statement. So that's basically what we're trying to do here.
One quick follow-up comment, and then I'll be done. So the notion of polysemanticity, or I'm getting confused now, but basically the idea here is that we want to induce a model that separates the concepts into sort of like constituent parts. That is, as you've pointed out, up to an empirical fact. It's dependent upon the input data, the corpus of the language that you ingest in it. So we would expect in a formal language like mathematics, were we to ingest that we would see much more regularity, right? Like concepts would likely map out between different languages of math, algebra analysis, into similar types of neurons, no? Or is that too vague of a question to ask?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but I mean, I would definitely guess that mathematicians, when they speak about mathematics, would be speaking about concepts in a much more disentangled way than the average person who is not speaking in mathematics. I mean, I feel like one of the things that mathematicians do very well is say precisely what they mean by any particular concept. And when you go out in the world and you try to explain that concept to others, essentially what I feel like you're doing is trying to like make some bijection between some hypothetical disentangled neuron in my brain versus your brain. But that process itself is also quite hard. But I mean, I do actually think that this notion that in general, our real world models are actually entangled is important because it's expressing the fact that, the sort of empirical fact that, that concepts do get entangled. Meaning, like what you mean by something is maybe slightly different than what somebody else means by something. Anyway, I'm mostly blabbing, but I think, yeah, you're kind of getting at a lot of things that I have thought about.
Got it. No, I think I'll go ahead and try to make my statements more precise and put them on the Zulip app. But thank you so much. This was very insightful.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Hey, Ellie.
Hey, Rob.
Is there like a toy model of this stuff that one could look at and sort of get a sense about what's going on from that?
Toy model.
Like, low dimensional things but just they have to be properly chosen so that they show what you want to show and see what you want to see.
I mean, yeah, I'm sure that there are. I mean, you might check out the examples that are on that blog post that I linked to in the last email. I mean,
Okay.
but yeah, I mean,
I can just try some things myself, but if you happen to know what good numbers are for, various of the parameters and such to get it to, to get a decent picture of what's going on, that would save me a little work.
I mean, I don't have any like explicit computations that I've done.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, anything you would do would probably be new to me.
Okay. Thanks, Ellie.
All right. See you.